opportunity.
Thank you very much. And good evening, everybody. And I say first of all how pleased I am to be back here at the Newton Irish Forum. It doesn't seem like nearly a year since I was last here. And my visit last November, I think it was, has left an indelible impression upon my memory. Those of you who were at that will know exactly what I mean. I really enjoyed it. I hope that you will enjoy what I have to say over the next 3/4 of an hour or so. I have to stress right at the beginning, it's not a traditional interpretation of the significance of the Dublin Lockout in 1913, but I welcome all sorts of responses, all sorts of questions that you may have, and seconds out, let's start. Right, but first of all, I want to make the point that 100 years ago, at this time of year, September 1913, 20,000 of the most impoverished, destitute, casual workers in probably the whole of Western Europe were basically embroiled in a struggle to the industrial death with their ruthless employers. I'm talking about the members of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union who did not go on strike, were locked out by their employers at the end of August 1913 and remained locked out of their employment for 4.5 months. The first point I want to make is that I think we need to sort of strip away the romanticism and dare I say it, the nostalgia surrounding the story of the Dublin Lockout, because no matter how important it was, and it was important in particularly the development of a trade union and labour movement, and as regards the development of industrial relations in Ireland, let alone its significance as regards the later events in the national struggle, and I want to come on to that shortly, we mustn't ignore the fact that, putting it quite bluntly, it was a complete and utter failure. 4.5 months later, in January 1914, James Connolly, one of the leaders of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, basically told his members to try and return to work on whatever terms they could get from the employer. So that's the first point to make. Despite its significance, despite the fact that 100 years later we all recognise it as being the beginning of the labour movement, the beginning of an assertive trade union movement in Ireland, at the time it was a failure. It was a complete and abject failure. Now, I mentioned the 20,000 of the poorest casual workers who were out on strike from September or the end of August 1913 until January 1914. This is in the second city of the British Empire. This is in a city which by any standards had a certain degree of prosperity and a certain degree of wealth. The conditions that these people lived in, the tenement conditions which we're all familiar with, were not replicated in any other city in the United Kingdom at the time. Yes, there were slums in Glasgow and Liverpool and Manchester and the other 19th century industrial cities, but they did not approach the level of poverty and deprivation that the tenement dwellers of the north inner city, the area around, primarily around modern-day Marlborough Street, Gardner Street, or the south inner city, the Liberties, for example. None of the workers in Glasgow, Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle, as bad as the conditions that they lived in were, they did not approach the level of poverty and deprivation and sheer degradation that so many people lived in the tenements in Dublin in the early 20th century. And why did this happen? Why did this happen? That's one of the issues I want to look at. First of all, we need to be aware of the fact that the tenements that these people are living in were, ironically, the palatial homes of the Anglo-Irish gentry of the early 19th century, late 18th century, when Ireland had its own parliament. It attracted to the city the great Georgian development, so that the lords and peers and the legal people and the MPs and all the rest of it could be based close to the parliament in College Green. When that parliament was done away in 1801, and throughout the course of the 19th century, these tenement buildings, as they became, the great palatial Georgian terraces of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy, slipped further and further into poverty and decay, with slum landlords, many of them, it's got to be said, Catholic and nationalist landlords, adherents to the Home Rule movement, who basically acted as, for example, you're all familiar, most of you will be familiar with Rathbonism in the 1960s in London. Constant subdivision, so that in any one of these houses, and we have the Henrietta Street exhibition displayed up here, any one of those houses could be occupied by over 100 people. And it was the breadwinners of these families who sought to eke out an existence, casual work, in which they turned up each morning to try and get employment in the docks, in all sorts of labouring jobs, that led to the establishment in 1909 of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union by James Larkin and James Connolly. Now, before I go on, perhaps I should explain why I entitled this lecture The Strange Death of Labour Ireland. Let me explain briefly. In the 1930s, the British historian George Dangerfield wrote a book entitled The Strange Death of Liberal England, in which he sought to establish why the great Liberal Party of Lloyd George and Asquith, who prior to the First World War introduced the beginnings of the welfare state, prosecuted the campaign in the First World War, but by 1924, 1925 was almost extinct and never again, until Mr. Clegg became Deputy Prime Minister, appeared in government for the remainder of the 20th century. And Dangerfield analysed the rapid decline, the strange death of Liberal England in the following terms. He said, one, the party was unable to prosecute the war successfully. The party split in 1916 because Lloyd George was persuaded by the Conservatives to ditch Asquith, who was regarded as being a weak war leader, and as we know, Lloyd George went on to become the man that won the war. Splits inside the Liberal Party. But also, he said, apart from the Liberal Party being, and he adopted this amazing quote, what was it? Run down by the rampant omnibus of war. They couldn't, because they weren't committed towards prosecuting the war, they couldn't manage a successful war effort. That led to a split in the Liberal Party, but also, he said, they were also overtaken by the rise in support for the new Labour Party. Particularly after 1918, when you had almost universal manhood suffrage and nearly universal female suffrage, it was inevitable that the Liberal Party would be replaced by an up-and-coming Labour Party, which would represent the working man and woman now with the vote, and also would become a replacement Progressive Party in British politics. I say all that to indicate how he identified the factors which he believed led to the collapse of the Liberal Party as a major political party in Britain over a relatively short period, the major factor being the First World War. In Ireland, I believe that you had a similar process taking place. You had, as we see, the revolutionary potential of the 1913 Dublin lockout, and it was revolutionary. I'll come on to that in a minute. But the lockout resulted, as I said, in complete and utter defeat for the workers. Connolly, one of the leaders of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, obviously decided that the social revolution could not take place before the national revolution occurred, threw in his lot with the militant Republicans, with the IRB and also the romantic nationalists, people like Pearse and MacDonagh. And the net result, I would argue, is that Connolly sacrificed the strength of the nascent, up-and-coming Irish labour and trade union movement on arguably the altar of Irish republicanism. And as a result of that, the impact of the labour and trade union movement in subsequent Irish politics, the politics of the independent Irish state, was dissipated, was obliterated, and as I said, the story of labour in independent Ireland is one of unfulfilled potential in which it was constantly overshadowed by the forces of Irish militant nationalism. So I make a comparison between the experience of the Liberal Party and the experience of the Labour Party in Ireland. The Irish labour movement was destroyed by forces that occurred in Ireland during the First World War, which led to a movement away from the Home Rule, the constitutional Home Rule parties, towards a more militant form of republicanism. And Labour made the fatal mistake, apart from taking part, or elements of it taking part in the 1916 Rising, it made the fatal mistake in 1918 of not contesting the general election in 1918, thus handing the political stage over to the forces of Sinn Féin and militant republicanism. So that from 1918 until 1922, there were no Labour MPs or TDs to put forward the Labour and trade union, the socialist argument, either in negotiations with the British, nor in negotiations with the two sides of republicanism in the Civil War. Labour only returned to the centre of Irish politics in the independent Irish state in the general election of June 1922. And my argument is that that was far too late to have a meaningful say in how the new free state, how the new independent Irish political entity would develop. So that's the parallel I make between the experience of the British Liberal Party and the Irish Labour Party. And like the British Liberal Party, the Irish Labour Party was beset by splits, personal animosities for Lloyd George and Asquith, Reid Connolly and Larkin, who certainly didn't get on together, and then subsequently, after Connolly was executed in 1916, Larkin and William O'Brien, one of the founders, along with Larkin and Connolly, of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union in 1909. And also poor leadership. Poor leadership, the decision by the post-Connolly and Larkin leadership of the Labour Party in deciding not to contest the general election and basically acquiescing, taking a backseat in the politics of the War of Independence, the Civil War, and then the independent state from 1922 onwards. Now, the next point I want to make is that one of my problems with looking at the significance of the Dublin lockout is that all too often it's seen as merely a curtain raiser, a precursor to the beginning of the 10-year process in Irish politics, which, as we know, and this is what I was talking about, I think, last November, which leads, it seems, looking at it from our point of view 100 years on, inexorably towards the successful conclusion of Irish independence through 1916, through the War of Independence, the Civil War, the establishment of the Irish Free State. But I would suggest to you that we shouldn't do it that way, because to the people of 1913, we're talking about their future. They didn't know what was going to happen. Their future is our past. We have the benefit of hindsight. And that's one of the reasons why we look at 1913 as, part of the revolutionary movement, which leads to 1916 and then ultimately to Irish independence. But they didn't know any of that. So let me just spend a couple of minutes looking at Ireland in 1913, just before the First World War. To most people, to all people, arguably, even the most committed Irish Republicans in the IRB, to people like Tom Clarke and Sean McDermott, not Patrick Pearse. Pearse, as late as 1915, was a committed Home Ruler. He only became a Republican late on, just before the Easter Rise in 1916. But even to the most committed IRB man, in 1913, it looked as if it was just a matter of time, a matter of months, before Ireland had received from the British government its own Home Rule Parliament. That's what everybody expected to happen. That's what the Labour movement expected to happen. That's what Larkin and Connolly expected to happen. And that's the reason why the Irish Labour Party was set up in 1912, so it could take its seats in the Home Rule Parliament and become an effective opposition. Nobody expected what we know happened, over the following 10 years to happen. And that's what I mean when I say their future is our past. We have the benefit of hindsight, of looking back and seeing what happened, and I think that's the reason why 1913 is seen quite, in my view, romantically and nostalgically as one of the precursors of the whole process that leads to Irish independence in 1922. Now, the other point to make is that the Ireland, just before the First World War, was, yes, part of the United Kingdom, part of the British Empire, but by and large, the democratisation of Irish politics had taken place throughout the whole of the 19th century. As early as 1841, 1841, Daniel O'Connell became the first Catholic Lord Mayor of Dublin since James II's time, because the British were determined to keep Ireland as part of the United Kingdom, as part of the British Empire. But inside those parameters, they were prepared to bend over backwards to give, over the course of the 19th century, the greatest amount of democracy to the Catholic nationalist population, short of giving them home rule, certainly not independence. They thought that by giving a substantial amount, and by the beginning of the 20th century, that meant the complete democratisation of Irish local government, for example, so that particularly in the south, any town, city that had a Catholic nationalist majority, it was run by Catholic nationalists. Different position, of course, up in the northeast. The British bent over backwards to try, from their point of view, to give the Irish as much as they possibly can to undermine their resentment towards the British colonising power, short of home rule. So that's why we had the land reforms of the 1880s and the 1890s, and that's why we have Dublin, by the beginning of the 20th century, being controlled not by, it's a bit of a cliche, not by an Anglo-Irish ascendancy. Yes, the Lord Lieutenant and the Viceroy lived in the Viceregal Lodge and was the King's representative, the government's representative over in Ireland. But underneath that, Dublin in particular was run by Catholic home rulers and had been for nearly 20 years. There were over 40 home rulers on Dublin Corporation. There were only, I think, 8 or 9 Sinn Féiners, we're talking now about just before the First World War. And ironically, the Sinn Féiners, from time to time, entered into an unofficial coalition with, of all people, the Unionists, who also numbered 7 or 8, 9 on Dublin Corporation, to counter what was the rampant corruption of the Home Rule Party, which controlled Dublin Corporation. And the reason I tell you this is because, yes, the slums were bad. And ultimately, the British imperial power was responsible. But who could have done something about the slums? And that somebody was the Home Rule Party which actually controlled Dublin Corporation. As it wasn't until the Free State came into existence in the 1920s, and probably in terms of a thoroughgoing reform of the situation, demolition of the slums, building of new estates, it wasn't until De Valera took control in the 1930s that the tenements and the slums that I was talking about actually began to be demolished and the housing conditions began to be improved. The point I'm making is that Home Rulers, Catholic nationalists, were in control of Dublin at the time when the tenements were at their worst. Not only that, but Catholic Home Rulers were also in charge of an awful lot of the businesses and trades who employed on a casual basis the people that I talked about right at the beginning, the impoverished, downtrodden slum dwellers who turned up every morning trying to see if they were going to be offered a day's work. So I want us to try and get away from this image that it's the horrible British imperialists who are exploiting the downtrodden Irish trade unionists. Ultimately, Britain is responsible for Dublin. Britain is responsible for Ireland. But in Dublin itself, in the years up to the First World War, the Home Rulers had been in control for 20 years. Now, many of these Home Rulers had a very, very ambivalent attitude towards trade unions. Had an even more ambivalent, not to say downright derogatory attitude towards the denizens of the slums and towards the people who went on strike or were locked out in the autumn of 1913. The most famous of these, of course, was the leader of the employers, William Martin Murphy, who's gone down in history as being the the eminence grise of the Dublin Lockout. Now, I have to say again, in the context of modern Ireland at the time, William Martin Murphy, a committed Catholic Home Ruler, committed Catholic nationalist from Cork, was a progressive force. He was a progressive force. He was exactly the sort of person who we lauded to the skies 20 or so years ago when the Irish economy began to take off. I'm not talking about recently, but certainly he was a sort of a go-ahead thrusting businessman with entrepreneurial spirit who provided jobs, who provided prosperity for, in this case, so many people in Dublin. He was at the cutting edge of progress. Not only did he control the Dublin United Tramways, he also controlled the new department store, Cleary's. He was the Selfridge, or Whiteley, of the Irish up-and-coming Catholic middle class, at the same time as those two were operating in London just before the First World War. He also owned the Imperial Hotel on Sackville Street, O'Connell Street, which is where the balcony was, where Larkin made that famous speech that led to the riot, where the Dublin Metropolitan Police started knocking about the strikers and killed 2 people in August 1913. Now, the Catholic middle class, like Murphy, they feared the people who lived in the slums. Murphy and other Catholic employers, and there's evidence to suggest that the Protestant employers, and there were quite a few, Jacobs for example, Jacobs Biscuits, they were Quakers, they put Murphy to the forefront in order for it not to be seen, the lockout, as basically the Protestant Anglo-Irish ascendancy, the upper class, against the downtrodden Catholic working class. Murphy was representative of this up-and-coming Catholic middle class who were the backbone of the Home Rule Parliament, the Home Rule Party, and who would be expected to be the leading lights